this session with the presentation of Dr. Rashid Hamid from the United Nations. Professor Rashid is the chief of the Global Economic Monitoring Department of Economics and Social Affairs of the United Nations. And he will be precisely giving a discussion, a presentation as regards the concept of reforming the global economic governance exclusively from the United Nations perspective. So, Professor, welcome, and the floor is yours. Please, you can start, and then we are going to continue with the others so that we can have a discussion at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Castaneda, and good morning, good evening, colleagues from New York. Just to add a disclaimer that I work for the UN, but my views here would be my personal views because we don't have a unified views or perspective on global economic reform or global economic governance. But much of my views would also reflect some of the discussions that we have at the UN among the member states and among different UN agencies and funds and programs. Having said that, let me just begin and sort of break it down to some simple elements that could be helpful for us to frame the issues that we have before us. When we talk about global economic governance, we are basically talking about the post-Bretton Woods system, that the legacy of it, and how that is still shaping global economic decision-making. And tied to that idea of Bretton Woods and post-Bretton Woods system that we have is the issue of global reserve currency and the status of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, and that is tied to the global economic governance. And I'll explain in a bit how they're related. As we know, all of us know that Bretton Woods system collapsed in between 1968 and 1973, partly because the gold standard was not sustainable at that time. The US at some point had to basically abandon the gold standard, said that we can't back US dollars with gold, especially when President de Gaulle of France started cashing all the treasuries for gold. And that since then, we have had a floating system since 1973, but still the dollar is the reserve currency, global reserve currency, and it stayed maintained that status over the last almost 50 years. How so? And this is the paradox. This is what is known as Triffin dilemma or Triffin paradox that was identified by an economist in the late 60s. A country that wants to be a global reserve currency or a dominant player in the global economy has to constantly run current account deficits, meaning that it has to provide a huge supply of the currency so the rest of the world can hold it. And that's how it maintains its dominant position. And if you look at this dilemma over the years, US has been running current account deficits since 1991. Last time it had a surplus was in 1991. And overall current account deficits in the last 20 years basically increased about 50-fold. Now it's $10.4 trillion cumulatively, in the last 20 years. And that's a huge amount of supply of dollars to the rest of the world economy that basically retains the dollar's preeminent status as a global reserve currency. And that also ties to the issue of global economic governance, because almost every transaction that we have globally, 85% of trade, about 90% of global debt, whether it's involving two different countries, excluding the US, still are denominated in dollars. So in order to break this status quo or to change to an alternative framework, we needed other countries to come forward and also run large current account deficits. We expected that with the euro, when the euro was consolidated, but still, there's a lot of ambition for euro to be a global reserve currency, but it cannot happen unless European Union or euro area are willing to run large deficits vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Same is true for other aspiring currencies. So in a way, US is providing a global public good by running large current account deficits year after year that is allowing the rest of the world to hold US assets, US denominated assets. But also the downside of that, this is a highly unstable and potentially a volatile economic environment, because what we know is that the US net investment position right now is negative $21.5 trillion. That basically means that the rest of the world has claims on US assets by $21.5 trillion. And just in the last 5 years, it doubled. Basically, there's a huge addiction and appetite for US dollar-denominated assets. And that is partly because in a normal economic environment, without the paradox, what would have happened if a country is running such current account deficits year after year, we would see a major adjustment in the exchange rates. But since US dollar is a reserve currency, it doesn't adjust downward. Actually, it appreciates. Paradoxically, it appreciates in value. If you look at the last, during the last 18 months, the dollar has appreciated vis-a-vis the major currencies. And that has remained a paradox because everyone is willing to land in US dollars and hold the US dollar dominated assets because that is considered the safest asset in the world. And that is creating a huge imbalance globally. And in order for us to come out of that and more egalitarian and more sort of equitable global governance structure, we have to reduce our dependence on US dollars. But so far, we haven't seen that. Actually, John Maynard Keynes, way before the Bretton Woods system came into effect, he anticipated this problem. And he said the way to prevent that kind of a dependence on one currency, he proposed the creation of a different currency called Bancor. And the US at that time in 1945, 44, opposed it tooth and nail. They said, no, we cannot have an international reserve currency other than the US dollars. And that is now US is caught in its own situation where it has to supply this, run the current account deficit. It can maintain the reserve currency status, but it is also very much costly for the US economy on multiple levels. So that's the first the context that I needed to highlight, but I'll be very brief about the next two issues. The second issue that we have is that we have, despite this preeminence of US dollar, we see what I would call economic rivalry among the major economies. And this is different from what we had during the Cold War. Right now, the economic rivalry between the US and China, the second largest economy, is actually reaching a tipping point where there is a challenge to US hegemony, US dominance of the global economic governance structure. And China is, unlike the Soviet Union that we had during the Cold War, is a major economic power. And that is changing the balance to some extent. And Mr. Mahmoud mentioned the emergence of new development banks, emergence of the reform of the IMF. But these reforms are not keeping up with the change that we need in order to make the global economic governance more stable and more inclusive. They're not. The sequencing is not right in terms of we are doing the best we can, but the pace and sequence is probably not keeping up with the realities on the ground. If you look at the last quota reform in the IMF, China's share, the 14th. Five-year reform that came into effect in 2016, China's share quotas increased from 4% to 6.1%. Some adjustment. At the same time, yuan was added to the SDR basket. Yuan now accounts for 11% of the SDR weight, relative to 42% for US dollar and 31% for euro. Again, a move in the right direction. But again, this is not keeping pace with the realities on the ground, because if you look at the relative weight that is given to yuan, which is almost at the same level to pound sterling or Japanese yen, which is their each given weights of 8%. So these reforms need to be accelerated. And if you look at the last quota reform, there's been no adjustment in 2020. It has been postponed for 5 years. And that would be a cause of frustration for some of the member states that want to see or accelerate the reform in global economic governance. But the third and final issue that I would raise here, that while we are sort of stuck with the status quo because of the one country willing and able to run current account deficits year after year, and whether China or the European Union, they want to have dominant roles in the global economic governance, but it has not been possible because neither of those two economic powerhouses are willing or able to run large current account deficits and supply the global economy with a huge amount of euros or yuan. But the challenge that this global economic governance is facing right now is not from China, not from European Union or from other aspiring emerging economies, but from technological change. And this is the last point I would say, is that while we can expect the dollar to continue as a dominant currency, but there's a dollar has a rival right now. The cryptocurrencies are coming up, and there's very little national control over the supply of cryptos of different kind. And if you look at the surge of crypto, I'm not talking about the volatility of the crypto prices, but crypto as a store of value, as an alternative store of value, and a medium of exchange. There's nothing national regulators can do to prevent that. And that change is inevitable because that's disruptive. And that's where the money is basically what people accept as money. The fiat currency that we have globally is basically because we trust in dollars. We trust in dollars, that's why we accept dollars. And if Bitcoins and other different currencies that are Ethereum and others are coming into the pipeline, I think the global economic governance would fundamentally change. And this is where central banks would not be able to control money supply. Money supply would be controlled by technologists, spread globally, and because they would be able to create liquidity at will, and that would have a significant spillover effect on the traditional economic structure and monetary structure that we have. The tragedy or risk that we have is that we are not prepared for that. We haven't even figured out how to regulate the crypto world. There's no global consensus. There are a lot of discussions here and there. I think that's where I hope we can spend a lot of time about discussing how the new world order would look like under a parallel structure where you have the national currencies and currencies that are without borders, currencies that would be created by Bitcoin miners and other miners who would create value almost from thin air, and that would create challenge the status quo that we have in the global economic governance. And we need to be prepared for that globally, also at the regional level. But I see very little regulatory discussion in that direction. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.